Welcome back. We will now begin the third session on the theme Gender Development and International Relations. The session will be chaired by Ms. Subhalakshmi Nandi, Senior Program Officer, Gender Equality, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The first speaker of the session is Dr. Devyani Khobragade, Ambassador of India to Cambodia. Our second speaker, Dr. Sona Mitra, Principal Economist, Initiative for What Works to Advance Women and Girls in the Economy, will be speaking on women's economic empowerment, what needs to be monitored. Our third speaker, Professor Sabiha Hussain, Director, Sarojini Naidu Center for Women's Studies, Jamia, Milia, Islamia, due to unavoidable circumstances, have been unable to join us. Her paper would be read by Dr. Deepika Saraswat, Research Fellow, ICWA. Any questions directed to Professor Hussain would then be emailed to her. Our last speaker of the session is Professor Vibhuti Patel, Professor Retired, Advanced Center for Women's Studies, School of Development Studies, TIS, Mumbai, who will be speaking on the trajectory of women's rights in India and the larger perspective of the human rights framework. This will be followed by a discussion and a Q&A session. I would take this opportunity to mention some home rules. All the speakers and panelists are requested to mute themselves when not speaking. Questions will be taken during discussion and Q&A session. Panelists can ask questions to speakers live through raise hand option. Questions can also be asked through typing through the chat box. These will be visible to the panelists. Questions may be kept brief and to the point. In case you're facing connectivity issues, you may switch off the camera and continue on the audio mode. I now request Ms. Subhalakshmi Nandi to moderate the proceedings. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ankita. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very, very illustrious panel. It's my honor and privilege to be here with all of you. Thank you very much, ICWA, for inviting me. And I think a panel on gender and development is something very close to my heart, and I would be very remiss if I didn't start off by saying, you know, when we start talking about gender and development, we have to remind ourselves that this terminology also actually has a particular history in international relations, in the history of the women's movement. And the history lies in the Beijing Platform for Action, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, where 189 countries across the world had signed up to this charter, this Bill of Women's Rights and Gender Equality in 1995 in Beijing, in Huanai, actually. And I think we all use the term gender and development 25 years later, but I think I do want to start this session by reminding ourselves about how important that 1995 milestone was in the history of gender and international relations, gender and development. I think for the first time there was acceptance by UN member states and within the UN framework of the need to look at gender mainstreaming as a cross-cutting theme, whether it is in peace and security, whether it is in sort of the human rights space, or it is in the development work, the three pillars of the UN. I think for the first time it was recognized that it's not just enough to, as they say, add women and stir, but to actually have women's voices, women's perspectives, women's ideologies, and representation and a whole gendered analysis factored into everything, in every domain of international relations work, whether it pertains to aid, trade, or national security or global security. So I think that was one of the important milestones based on which, you know, this session and this whole discourse has evolved in the last 25 years. 25 years later, where are we? We are bang in the middle of a health pandemic. We are in the middle of a crisis. We're struggling as a global economy. There have been there's been huge impact on markets. There's been huge social and inequity-related impacts. We know about all of that. We also know, interestingly, that where there has been women's leadership, including in sort of political leadership in countries, we also know that the pandemic has been addressed differently from countries where you know there have been male leadership, and I think there is a lot of writing out in the media and a lot of analysis around, you know, what did these women leaders do right And so I think that's another interesting point of discussion as we enter this session. The second thing I want to say is that in 2020 today, we are also 5 years into the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals, of course, again, I think what was really important and the point of difference from the MDGs to the SDGs was this whole emphasis around gender mainstreaming and gender and development as a cross-cutting priority across all the 17 goals, but also the need to have a standalone goal for gender equality. And I think that was also a fairly political decision when it came to member states, when it came to the whole global community on gender equality advocacy, because I think by then we had seen about 15, 20 years of gender mainstreaming in the world. And we had also realized as a global development community about how it was not really working because, if everything is gender, then nothing is gender. So, what is that lens? What is that additional perspective? What is the analysis of power relations that we are bringing into the development work was something that was critical and at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think it was critical, again, in reviving the letter and spirit of the Beijing Declaration Platform for Action around gender and development. So I think it was a big, big milestone. The Sustainable Development Goals 5 in particular, of course, looked at some of the very specific structural barriers that still remain at the time that the SDGs were framed, and I think continue to be huge gaps in the global sort of scenario still, whether it is about women's voice and representation and leadership, whether it is women's agency, their access to economic opportunities, their access to services, and the third is really around safety and security. So these three pillars of safety, of security, choice, and voice were at the heart of SDG 5, which really provide also the cross-cutting framework to analyze and understand the other goals, I think. And that's what was very powerful about the SDGs, is that cross-cutting emphasis. The other thing that I want to say is that I think what this 25 years of gender and development as a discourse has done to the global community is it's created institutions. Many of the countries which didn't have dedicated ministries for gender or dedicated ministries for women now have whole institutional frameworks around gender equality. There are gender budgeting, gender responsive budgeting tools that are being used to make sure that even at an operational level, it's not just a concept. It's a concept that can very easily be translated into a program, into a policy, into operations on ground. But it requires gender budgets, it requires gender focal points, it requires the whole institutional system backing the vision. And that progress we have seen in so many countries in the world, India included. And that's really been one of the biggest gains in the last 25 years since the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And I think what we have also seen is champions. And I cannot emphasize enough my own career in the last many years. I mean, I have worked in the UN, I have worked in the NGO sector, I now work in a philanthropic foundation. Wherever I go, I think I have also seen how in this journey that relationships have been so important in building those champions. And I think this was also very characteristic of the actual Beijing event 25 years ago. I wasn't there. I was still in high school 25 years ago. But I have heard from senior leaders who were at the forum about how important it was for the government to work together with gender equality advocates, to work with grassroots women's organizations, to work with the women's movement, to work with the UN architecture. At that point, UNIFEM was the anchoring agency, and how all of these stakeholders in international development, which is the governments as core stakeholders, so member states, the UN as a central player, and the women's movement as the third cog in the wheel, which kind of came together to make sure that this momentum reached where it actually did in the form of a global declaration, which has provided us the roadmap for public policy in our countries ever since. And so I think that is the learning there again. I think it was to a great extent emulated also in the SDG formulation, though maybe not as dynamic, but there was this whole process of where, and some researchers have called that term femocrats. So femocrats are your feminists and gender advocates in the government or in the UN, and they work very closely with the civil society and gender advocates in the movements, and they both together as champions for gender equality really create the momentum for highest level decision making around gender equality and commitments at the global level. And that's something we saw in Beijing, that's something we saw in SDGs, and I know I'm running out of time, but I think I just wanted to set this context as we go into this really interesting session where we have very diverse perspectives as well around gender and development in international relations. And as Ankita has already introduced the panel, we will start with Dr. Devyani Khobragade, who has recently been appointed as the ambassador to Cambodia from Government of India, and I will hand over to her as the first speaker for this session. Thank you. Oh, we can't hear you, Dr. Khobragade. I think you're on mute still. Yeah.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Mrs. Nandi, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me, Ambassador Raghavan, to this very, very important conference on women and power. I think we have come a long way from when Madeleine Albright said, and I quote, that the only way a woman could truly make her foreign policy view felt was by marrying a diplomat and then pouring tea on an offending ambassador's lap. So from that to now, I think we have really come quite far. And while I've been asked to speak on international gender and international development by Ambassador Raghavan, I will touch upon the praxis of it in the Ministry of External Affairs, and I will leave the discussion on the on the theory and the academic perspective, academic part of it, to this very robust academic conference and its participants. I will focus more on my, what animates me and what inspires me is the journey of the women in praxis in foreign policy and the historicity of it, and how we have, from the start to now, where we are in the Indian context, and of course more in the international context, because as you all aware, we do have, while Ambassador Puri did point out that we do have a very strong feminist movement in India, especially feminist economists and eco-feminists and so on. But the study of the praxis of and women in active foreign policy still lags behind, and we don't have much of it, unfortunately, available. So looking at historically, of course, diplomacy and statecraft have always been the preserve of men, and that's natural since they had the monopoly to power. And the normative framework defined that just like the household, the state has to be run by men. And this thinking was reflected in the practice of diplomacy, and not just, until early 20th century and to a little extent even now. But when the British diplomat Sir Harold Nicholson quoted Machiavelli in stating that female zeal, sympathy, and intuition are dangerous qualities in international affairs, that sort of sums up the normative framework that prevented women from entering this profession. And it wasn't without a great struggle that women had to enter diplomacy. And that, of course, which had been a preserve of only royalty and royal women. And we have examples also in India of of the famous Rani of Jhansi and Razia Sultana and Jahanara, to quote some of, to mention some of them. But while Albright has very well captured the sort of almost the ban on so-called almost a ban on women entering the foreign service, we have had since the formal entry began in various foreign services with the First and Second World War, we've had examples to follow, and our constitutional founding fathers of our constitution, while adopting equality for all within the constitutions, opened the door of foreign policy for Indian women early on in its inception. Women got representation in the foreign service right at the beginning in 1946. However, the heritage of some of the discriminatory rules in matter of promotion and appointments that we inherited from the British, especially the very infamous marriage bar, which was withdrawn as late as the 1970s, which instructed women, single women, to resign from their appointments in the event of their marriage, forcing them to choose between marriage and careers, has led to a significantly skewed gender ratio in the Indian Foreign Service, which is, of course, rectifying itself slowly but steadily now. However, the path of women in diplomatic career has been an uphill one, even globally, with very few reaching the top of career ladders. And we all know how India first posted its woman foreign service diplomat as an ambassador in 1970, and UK even later than that in 1976. So reformative measures have been very, very slow to come by, and not without a struggle. The US Court of Appeals ruling on class action suit brought against the State Department found that the department had violated a number of civil rights and engaged in several gender discriminatory practices. And the same was challenged by C.B. Muthama, our first woman foreign service officer, in 1975, in her very, very memorable and iconic case of C.B. Muthama versus Union of India. The number of opportunities for women diplomats have thus been very slow, but they've been rising towards the later half of the 20th century. The simultaneous growth of the academic work and research on feminist IR has also led to increased interest and the hitherto neglected area of gender in the context of studying foreign policy actors, decisions, and outcomes has thankfully been changing now. And as our previous panelists had a robust discussion on the IR scenario in the feminist foreign policy, feminist IR field, we have noticed that there are these changes in the normative framework that guide, that inform the socio-political and socio-cultural milieu in which women operate in the space of diplomacy. However, as studies reveal that still many of these dominant narratives from the earlier century still prevail. And again, I quote Ann Tickner here, when she says that the military and foreign policy are arenas of policy making least favorable, least appropriate for women. There is still a sense in the government that traditional fields of national security, defense, nuclear policy, and intricate policy matters are not things that women do. And women do social policy, women do environment, women do humanitarian things. This despite the fact that when they are given a chance, and we have the example of Arundhati Ghosh, who led our Indian delegation in the CTBT um, deliberations in the UN extremely successfully. There are still these studies which continue to show how female diplomats around the world uh, continue to face male chauvinistic behavior at work. They are required to work harder than their male counterparts. Also, about advancing the course of their careers, women face a lot of trouble in contrast to men who move upwards rather quickly. They also face, of course, many issues related to their personal lives and family lives. Feminist IR scholars have shown very clearly that greater gender equality leads to foreign policies that are less belligerent. Countries like Sweden and Canada have gained from this realization, and they've introduced explicitly comprehensively feminist foreign policies, mainly focused on empowerment and women's empowerment and gender equality. So, at the heart of these feminist foreign policies, there is the idea that it's not just gender sensitivity and gender parity that we need. We need a policy that prioritizes the full implementation of international and national commitments to advance human rights. So it further goes beyond gender mainstreaming. It contains a normative reorientation of foreign policy that is guided by an ethically informed framework based on broad cosmopolitan's norm of global justice and peace. These academic and political impetuses have a significant institutional impact, have had significant institutional impact, leading to a rise in the number of women diplomats over the last few decades in countries which have taken explicit measures and policy steps towards it, like fast-track recruitments in FCO in UK have led to the number of female diplomats rising to about 40% of the total foreign service strength. The Swedish Foreign Ministry, cadre, has got about 60% women employees in 2016, and they have accomplished having almost 40% heads of mission in 2017. That's impressive. As Sweden and Canada pursue these explicit feminist foreign policies, and academic research pursued by feminist foreign policy by writers and researchers on feminist foreign policies only gain more traction in academia and in government. I feel it's an imperative that we need to study and account for participation of and representation and role of Indian women policy and diplomatic space. Where is the question of gender parity and gender sensitivity in the context and foreign policy domain? Does an increased participation and representation of Indian women lead to foreign policies focused more on gender equality and women issues? These are some of the questions that we, as academicians, I hope that this conference leads to some focus on some of these issues that have been hitherto neglected in the research space in Indian academia. Further, even if Indian women assume more important roles in foreign policy decision mechanisms, they do, of course, face an order built on hegemonic masculinity. In ways that they can pursue more peaceful policies that are expected of them. So I feel the question then arises as to how Indian female diplomats have challenged the fallacy of women's unsuitability in diplomacy, and particularly women's unsuitability in hardcore, hard power areas such as military and nuclear defense and areas, regions and areas that are considered to be unsafe, undesirable and not a first choice for a woman diplomat. So we do. I think we really do need to look at more of the lived experiences of women diplomats who are, especially, I mean, starting with Mutamma's book, we really hardly have any experiences on the impact that women diplomats have created and how it has differed from fellow male colleagues in the conduct of foreign policy. To have they behaved masculine or signed masculine decisions versus diverging from their feminine values? I feel there is more need to examine the role of Indian women leaders, starting from Sarojini Naidu to in the more contemporary times, the role of Indira Gandhi, and of course the late Sushma Swaraj, the impact made by all of these women leaders in the foreign policy space. So have they been able to, for example, hold foreign policy decision-making mechanisms and challenge the stereotypical roles assigned to women in society as large and in the foreign policy structures to be more granular? So, and a prime example to be studied again, I come to Arundhati Ghosh, who led our, impressively led us in the UN. So despite this enormous interest in gender issues, there doesn't seem to be much of a preliminary research done in Indian context on how diplomacy has been conducted by Indian women diplomats and political leaders. To explore the ways that women have contributed to diplomacy of India, we do need to examine the socio-political dynamics of Indian diplomacy. However, there seems to be very little academic research on Indian women in foreign policy in both pre-independent times and post-independent era, right from the British to the present. There is also a need, I feel, to gather oral histories through interviews and memoirs and drawing on vivid portraits of different female diplomats through time and age, drawing attention to gender hierarchies and conduct of foreign policies through their times. Of the Indian women diplomats who quit the foreign service also need to be researched and understood. Like those of Meera Sina Bhattacharya and Rama Mehta, who needed to bear the brunt of that marriage bar, and were forced to leave the service to just get married. So, moreover, also roles of male Indian diplomats who have demanded the change in status quo within diplomacy. Also, I think needs to be looked at, particularly late Indian diplomats like Jane Dixit and KPS Menon would be very good examples of studies that perhaps academic circles could look at. So, from my perspective, I feel this very important conference it raises more questions rather than bringing answers to the table. And my hope and sort of the vision and mission of this conference is that it leads to looking at the journey of women in the Indian foreign policy and Indian diplomacy, to bring light to their multiple subjectivities and pluralities of their experience. Whether it is, of course, through hardcore research or just looking at oral histories, and it's that with that hope that I've come to this conference, and it was a wonderful experience, a learning experience to listen to all of you academicians and practitioners, of course, also in the development space. to listen to your perspectives. Coming to what I was asked to speak on, the international development and Indian foreign policy and gender, I have. From what I've seen in the 20 years of praxis in the foreign service, is that there is certainly the robust, international and academic developments, and also the sort of vibrant feminist discourse in our country have both led to a lot of change, positive change, and realization of how gender and development are completely interlinked, and that one cannot ignore the effect of ignoring women out of the development strategies and policies and paradigm, whether it is their inclusion in the double X economy, including women in economic development, or whether it is their development pertaining to sexual rights, health, and every other aspect of development, whether it is inclusion of jobs or governance and digital space and so on and so forth. And this has, of course, percolated down also within the foreign policy ministry and its thinking and its journey and its policies. And as Ms. Nandi mentioned, we have adopted tools and mechanisms such as gender budgeting. And I have seen the development of how gender budgeting was gradually accepted within the foreign policy, within our establishment. Whereas earlier we would only look at gender budgeting from the perspective of women diplomats and the amount of money that was going, the amount of finances that were going for their salaries and their welfare and their looking at possibilities of having a creche and so on, to how then we moved on to looking at how much of development development cooperation money of all our development cooperation aid was also going towards programs that were directly affecting women and development, gender and development in internationally in all our international programs. And since early 2000, around 2000, mid 2000s to now, we have come to a stage where we examine most of our development cooperation work, particularly that which is dealing with capacity building, and I can speak of that because I was looking at our development cooperation work in the capacity building space before I was posted here as ambassador to Cambodia. And we have examined every capacity building program from the perspective of the SDGs and how women programs, capacity building programs that led to women's development have been projected and included in our development cooperation and gender budgeting policies. So one of the prime...
Dr. Khobragade, if you could please wrap up in a couple of minutes, please.
Sure. Thank you so much. Sorry, so I will just wrap up by saying that one of our favorite, our grand successes of a development cooperation program, and which is very close to my heart, is the Barefoot College Solar Mamas that trains completely illiterate women from villages and makes them into solar engineers, and they carry forward and solar electrify their entire village. And this has been a grand success, especially in Africa, and all of you should maybe look at it. It's very, very interesting and inspiring. So I'll stop here, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Dr. Khobragade, for your insights on the lived experience, and I think you've also pointed out some of the research gaps that exist. Very, very valuable, I think, for this forum. And also, you touched upon how some countries have actually gone ahead and developed feminist foreign policy frameworks like Sweden and Canada at the beginning, but also more recently France and Mexico. Mexico, incidentally, the first country from the global south, and of course, France, Mexico, and UN Women are three partners that are co-organizing the Generation Equality Forum next year to mark the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. So it's interesting to see how in the multilateral space also we only have that one Mexico from the global south right now. And I think the rest are mostly from the donor country side perspective, if I speak from the development hat. So it'll be interesting how that narrative shifts and how feminist voices and women's leadership features in that next phase of work. Very quickly, I'm going to move now to my dear friend and brilliant feminist economist, Dr. Sona Mitra, who is the principal economist at IWAGE, the Initiative for What Works to Advance Women and Girls in the Economy. One of the things that Sona has been working on for many years is the element, one of the first tenets of the Beijing Declaration is around transforming and reforming macroeconomic policies. And I'm sure she's going to touch upon that, amongst other things that she's going to share with us today. Over to you, Sona.
Thank you. Thanks, Wu, for the generous introduction. And thank you to Dr. Ankita at the ICWA and Sabiha University for giving me this opportunity to present in this wonderful conference on women and power. I think it is very timely. And as Subhalakshmi in the beginning said that it's going to be a diverse set of presentations, rightly so, because I'm going to really focus on a very different issue, which is on women's economic empowerment. It is part of the entire empowerment background that we're talking about, women's empowerment and development. So economic empowerment is something that I'm going to focus on. A little bit on macroeconomic policies at the end, but two things that I would like to focus on here. Before that, I just want to share my screen because I have a few slides to show you. So I'll just start sharing my screen.
Dr. Mitra, use the option of share screen at the top of the screen. There's an option.
I am, but I don't see that is working. So
please open your presentation before.
I got it, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Is it visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay. No. Sorry about that glitch. So what I want to do essentially is to actually, in the context of development, focus a little bit more on women's economic empowerment. And within that, I would like to focus a little more on what is it that we need to monitor in the current context of development. And when we speak about development and economic empowerment, there are one of the important measures of economic empowerment in any country has been the female labor force participation. It just features in all the discussions among the multilaterals, the access to economic opportunities comes in various forms and various methods, various terms. However, I think while economic empowerment is only a part of the entire women's empowerment and agency question, I think female labor force participation rates are one of the important measures and indicators of measuring the economic empowerment. And in this context, I just want to highlight this first slide which I have, which shows in the South Asian context, India has the second lowest female labor force participation rate, except for Pakistan, which basically has a little bit. It was more or less similar, but now even Pakistan has by the 2018-19 data, even Pakistan has marginally better female labor force participation rates than India. And if you look at this,
Sona, your slides are not moving. If you could put it on the slideshow mode and move to the second slide. I know you're on slide number 2, but we can't see it. We can only see slide 1.
How is it?
Put it on presentation mode. Perhaps that might help.
I'll just do that. Can you see the second slide?
Yes, it's now visible. Go ahead, please.
Okay. So, getting into that context of female labor force participation rates in the South Asian context, we find that India is actually well behind many of the countries, its South Asian counterparts. And the other interesting phenomena that is observed from this slide is that in most of the countries between 2012 and 2018, that is more or less, we can talk about, it's not a decade, but of course it is towards the beginning and the end of this decade. We find that all the countries, except for India and Pakistan, shows an increase in female labor force participation rates. If we compare with the male labor force participation rates for all these similar countries, we find that, of course, the Indian male labor force figures do not look so bad on comparative terms like the female counterparts, but India is probably the only country that shows a decline, and the rest of the countries where female labor force participation rates have increased, the male labor force participation rates have declined. For example, in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. And the countries where female participation rates have declined, that is Pakistan, the male participation rate has increased. India is the only country that shows a decline for both male and female labor force participation. I am making that point just to highlight the fact that there is in the context of development, there is a situation in the country where we are talking about creating remunerative employment for the economy, and that which also has an impact on development and women's economic empowerment. Now I turn my focus to the Indian context, where I just want to show you the trends in female labor force participation rates since the early 90s. And what we find here is not a very and these are official statistics that I'm referring to. I'll come to the problems with the official statistics a little later and touch upon briefly. But however, by the official statistics, the major concerns which is there in the feminist economics discourse has been this secular declines in women's labor force participation rate. Despite decent
Did we lose connectivity with Sona?
I think there are some connectivity issues on her end.
Yeah, it's just poor network, so I suppose hang on a couple of minutes.
Yeah, she is disconnected actually.
Ankita, do you want us to proceed? Should we wait for Sona or?
I think we should move on. We might never know what the issue is. So I think we should move on to the next speaker.
Yeah, I suppose when Sona connects back, we can have her catch up again. I'm actually going to move now to Dr. Vibhuti Patel. Vibhuti, again, an icon in the feminist movement and been a long-time champion of gender mainstreaming efforts in India. Many of us have learned from her, looked up to her for many, many years. So over to you, Vibhuti, for your presentation. Vibhuti, you'll need to unmute yourself. I think you're still on mute.
So my presentation is on the trajectory of women's rights in India in the larger perspective of human rights framework. The first discourse on the human rights framework in the newly formed women's groups happened in a post-emergency period. We know that it got momentum and the wide range of issues concerning right-based approach were taken up. There have been various ideological shades in the women's movement coexisting till the date, and all of them challenge patriarchal power from intersectionalities of caste, class, ethnicity, race, and gender. And in the morning, I think a lot was told about the different strands of feminism, so I won't go into detail. So during the last 4 decades, the politically articulate urban middle class educated women, as well as women from the marginalized sections like Dalit, tribal, industrial workers, agricultural laborers, poor migrant workers in the urban and rural areas, have mobilized against violence against women in the community, in the family, the witch hunting of women-headed households, mass rape of tribal and Dalit women, dowry murders, domestic violence, acid attacks, and custodial killings of young couples in the name of honor. And during 80s, the feminists who founded new women's rights organization, they differed from the earlier one, which talked about charity and philanthropy and social work. Like this feminists, they said, we are not fighting someone else's battle, we are fighting our own battle. But only thing that it is a collective wisdom with which we are fighting. And all forms of sexual oppression, and they considered women as an oppressed sex. They believe that like casteism and communalism, sexism is also one of the most collective, effective weapons utilized by the caste and class patriarchy to divide the masses. Hence, they believed in fighting against caste system, religious chauvinism, sexism, simultaneously. Socialist feminists have been more vocal and accepted throughout the country right from the early 70s. And their motto was personal is political, which was also a global slogan and was popularized by the international women's movement. And their personal lives, they practiced non-discriminatory attitude towards people of different religion, caste, ethnicity, and classes. Now, the Indian feminists consider that economic independence of women is a minimum necessary condition for women's liberation, but it is not enough. One must fight for women's rights in a socio-cultural, educational, political fields to achieve total liberation. They do not like the term social worker for themselves, and they are fighting for from the very beginning. Like women have fought for the legal provision to change women's position. And they have also fought against at a grassroots level, organizing women from the different socio-economic background. And the kind of a new ethos, new ideologies, new morality, and new egalitarian relations between men and women, there are a lot of formulations and conceptualization has taken place. The most refreshing input in this whole discourse was from Dalit feminists. They have become quite influential nationally and internationally during the last 2 decades. Dalit feminism analyzes Dalit women's oppression as a triple jeopardy of oppression by double patriarchies, discrete patriarchy of Dalit men, and also overlapping patriarchy by the upper caste men and women, as well as poverty, as well as argue And it also argues that envisioning of contemporary feminist politics by incorporating the ideological positions from plural standpoint. So I think that also came out in the morning session about the plurality of a plural source of knowledge construction in the women's movement. The central concern, like major highlights of the women's movement, have been fight against declining sex ratio, pre-birth elimination of girl child, which is facilitated by the modern technology, then the question of reproductive rights of women, the gender gap in literacy, gender gap in the workforce participation, about which Sona will be talking, and also the unpaid work that women are doing. The first time it was in Towards Equality report that brought out that issue of unpaid family labor that women do in terms of not only cooking, cleaning, carrying, which is a residual item, but also collection of fuel, fodder, water, animal care, and kitchen gardening. And the informalization of women, where 94% of women are in the workforce and are fighting for their rights. 33% reservation for women in the local self-government was achieved, but still we have a long way to go, because in the legislature and parliament we don't have the women's reservation, and currently also it is only 14%. So what is happening in the women in diplomacy, similar thing we see at the upper echelons of power structures. And also violence against caste-based and communal violence, ethnic chauvinism. I think these are also the issues women's movement has taken up right from in the post-emergency period. And now the question, the new challenges, the discourse of discontent that has come up because of this whole gender binary. Feminists are considered to be adhering to the gender binary of man and women. But what about the women who do not adhere to the heterosexual or endogamous marriage? They get punished severely by family, community, and criminal legal system. And fighting against homophobia and building solidarities with the LGBTQIA community is also now an integral part of the human rights perspective of the feminist movement. Now, coming to the question of feminism and intersectionality, and this has been currently it has been used in all the academic analysis and also in the women's movement. The intersectionality has become a
I think Vibhuti is also offline right now, right?
Yeah, I think we've lost her too as well.
Yeah, some of the occupational hazards of work from home and being dependent on internet, which may or may not be reliable. I think we'll just wait 2-3 minutes for her to connect back. Yeah. And then Sona, thanks you joined back. We'll go with your presentation after this.
Sure, thanks. Sorry about the power cut. It had to happen today. It's quite a rare event.
Okay.
There's a series of serious articulation of Dalit women's vulnerabilities, non-citizenship, social exclusion, and the new feminist consciousness to challenge Brahminical feminism and toxic patriarchy has contributed to valuable knowledge construction marked by the Dalit feminist her story. They don't call it history, they call it her story. The cyberspace has emerged as a potential space for transformational activism, even as the rise of and consolidation of religious identity alongside the shrinking of the welfare state has made Dalit women more vulnerable to exploitation and discrimination, and also leading to further marginalization, as Cynthia Striffen has articulated, again a Dalit feminist. On the other hand, there is a renewed spurt in the in the display of energy and activism of Dalit Women's Collective, All India Dalit Women's Forum, National Federation of Dalit Women, All India Dalit, they were founded in 94, 95, in the mid-90s around the Beijing Platform for Action. And at a global level, the UN World Conference Against Racism, held in Durban, South Africa in 2001, provided an opportunity to draw parallel between Dalit women's oppression and racism. And the Delhi Declaration of 2006 emerged around the same time with transnational Dalit feminist activism highlighting issues of survival and dignity, and even as there were other problematic issues of identity and sovereignty. When it comes to the development agenda of the women's movement, we see that right from the mid 70s, we have seen that the women's movement is highlighted. I don't want to get into the Wade-Gad approaches, which most of all three approaches are currently existing, and the approaches have been utilized by different grassroots and community-based organizations. So, but the new concerns that have emerged recently, like the efforts of women activists were directed towards agitation and propaganda for women's rights, then fight escalating violence against women, and also the team building to counter sexual harassment in the streets and workplace. Feminists are demanding equal share of women in public spaces such as streets and gardens and clubs and transport at any time of the day and night. During the 90s, women's movement demanding its legitimate space within the mainstream, within its own agenda of empowerment of women in partnership with men. And this has been like they have been able to identify its allies in all sections of society. So it's a horizontal and vertical networking that has created a congenial atmosphere to execute development agenda with the help of effective use of information technology, communication channels, modern managerial practices, efficient laws, and also different kinds of networks, global, local, and regional, that women's movement has this thing. Another very important development that has taken place because of the gender initiative by the International Feminist Economist Association is a gender responsive budgeting. The process started in South Asia by 2000, and during past 2 decades, gender politics around local, state and union budgets in India has sharpened its analytical rigor among gender economists as well as women's rights groups. The people's access to services and resources are determined by government budget policies. Gender budget initiatives around the world have attempted to systematically examine how government budgets address discrimination about the women's access to housing, employment, health, education, and other services. In the morning, in the initial, in the first session, there was a detailed discussion about the role of UN women in also accelerating this process, and also women's entry. 1 million women entering the local government bodies. There was also a demand from them that all the gender commitments that are made, they should be translated into financial commitment. And the realization of the women's movement that budget is an important tool in the hands of state for affirmative action for improvement of gender relations through reduction in gender gap. So that has been, I think, it is universally now accepted by all feminists in the rural, urban, and tribal areas. Then we come to the transnational feminism, and women's rights activists emerge from the struggles of solidarity of global issues such as anti-war movement, fight against racial discrimination. In fact, my initiation in the women's movement at the age of 15 happened with the solidarity for the Vietnam struggle. Working class and trade union movement, national liberation struggles in Africa, Latin America, and Asian countries, assertion of identity by native population and minorities. They were connected with international debates on the role of revolutionary movement in the women's liberation and relationship of women's movement with the state, and also why the need for autonomy of women's organization from the mainstream political parties, and also importance of networking with the perspective of think and act globally. When the American feminists say think locally, act globally, the women from South Asia, they said, no, we will think and act locally, and we will also think and act globally. And since the mid-80s, Indian feminists have played crucial role in international network for policy advocacy called DAWN, Development Alternatives with Women, the very important monumental document written by Geeta Sen and Karen Brown. The vision of DAWN has been crystallized in the development crisis and alternative vision. And largely the language of equal rights has been learned by the women's rights movement from the capitalist West, that we can say to start with. At a global level, neoliberal economy is dominating, but the struggles are moving on, gaining political ground. So cross-movement solidarity has been created in spaces like World Social Forum, the engagement with the Living Well movement, or in Latin America, or creating livelihoods in the shared economy. there is a positive trend in women's strength solidarity across regions and continents, and playing more significant role as decision makers in the movements to reclaim the commons. The convention CEDAW, or adopted by the UN in 1993. India is a signatory to it, and I think the CEDAW has been used as an instrument by the women's movement in their day-to-day struggles, also in advocacy and also mobilizing. A lot was discussed by Professor Asha Hans about the role of 1325, so I'm not going into that. So, but it has the peace has been a major concern of the women's movement, and even after the Nairobi forward-looking strategy and the Beijing plan of action, there have been organizations which are working at an international and the regional level. And the only hope in the transnational feminism at a grassroots and collaborative projects between grassroots women's networks and institutions such as WIGO, Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, Women Working Worldwide, and also global communication among feminist groups through like Association of Women's Rights in Development or Sangat or Dawn Network. These efforts have fostered grassroots transnational feminism and also sharing and learning about local solutions, local innovations, peer learning through successful strategies of collective action, capacity building, building alliances of through world at the World Social Forum, Regional Social Fora, Global Feminist Dialogue, and Women's March of World March of Women. All of them have created their own digital communities for day-to-day communication on an immediate action, perspective building, and also knowledge sharing. I would like to conclude by saying that the last 50 years of feminist activism has challenged 5,000 years of patriarchal order by striking at the root of exploitation and oppression, subjugation and degradation of women, by deconstructing covert and overt forms of violence and discrimination against women in personal and public lives. Question pillars of male domination within family, kinship, networks, organized religion, media, and state, and series of legal reforms with respect to family laws, dealing with marriage, divorce, custody of children, maintenance, inheritance, domestic violence, sexual violence, workplace harassment, maternity benefits, and gender budgeting. They have become part of the official agenda due to feminist movement. For this, the pioneers of women's rights movement and the feminist scholars have worked in unison. Again, I reiterate that the convergence of women's studies and women's movement. Gender politics has changed drastically due to simultaneous involvement in mass mobilization and grassroots level activism, as well as proactive participation of women in decision-making bodies of government and non-government structures at all levels, from local self-government to boardrooms of corporate governance and international foundations and INGOs. Thank you very much for giving me opportunity to share my thoughts. And in 15 minutes, I'd like to bring out whatever has transpired in the women's movement over the last 50 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vibhuti. It's fantastic listening to you just narrate her story, not the history, her story of the movement. And I think some of the things that you were talking about when it comes to transnational feminism, the whole solidarity, and I think how this relates to our current conversation on gender and development in IR is also because that's also, like you said, tools and mechanisms of multilateralism have actually helped to boost some of that agenda. And therefore the role of diplomacy, the role of democrats, and of course women's movement on that one side doing the agenda setting, and also really grateful that you brought in the perspectives around intersectionality. I think very, very critical. And also you mentioned towards the end the women's studies and the women's activism at some point used to be very closely linked. It's something for us to reflect on, has academia and activism today. So that's something to think about. And very quickly, I'll move back now to Sona to continue with her presentation.
Yeah.
Sona, over to you.
Thank you, Subhalakshmi, and sorry for that break. I hope you can all see my screen. So, can you?
Yes, Sona, we can see it. Please go
Yes. Okay. So, as I was harping on the female labor force participation rate, just very quickly to highlight that despite levels of decent levels of economic growth and decent declines in female fertility rates, rise in the schooling of girls, India has not been able to increase its female labor force participation rate as per the official statistics. However, there are a few corollaries to the entire story about the female labor force participation. Now, two factors that emerge as the most insidious, yes, the least discussed within the discourse of women's economic participation and therefore development in India, one of which pertains to the way women's employment is measured and recorded in the official labor statistics, which potentially excludes a range of activities performed by women, leading to invisibilization of women's work. And here I'm talking about the unpaid component of women's work that we touched upon briefly. And the second pertains to the suitability of job opportunities that exist for women. So in order to track the female labor force participation rate, it cannot be an exercise in isolation tracking the women's economic participation rate. It has to bring into the perspective women's unpaid work and also bring into perspective that what are the kind of opportunities that exist for women. Having said that, I just want to provide a global dimension, just a quick picture of how unpaid work operates in different regions of the world. And if you see that the blue bar, which represents the unpaid work, is substantial for women in all parts of the world, and that's therefore a global phenomenon. What happens in the Asia-Pacific or the South Asian context is provided by this slide, where you find that India is probably one of the most severe cases where we find the gender gap in unpaid work. I think the most substantial. The total work performed by the difference in total work performed by women and men, which include unpaid and paid work, is the gap is the maximum in the subcontinent and is led by India. Now, having said that, I want to draw attention to some of the recent data that has emerged from the Time News survey conducted by the government of India for the year January 2019 to December 2019. And in that, if you look at this table, if you will find that the first two rows provide glimpses to employment, which is recognized and remunerated, which is production, economic production, and men spend 222 minutes more on such productive work compared to women. Whereas the yellow highlighted ones, which are basically the care work, in that women spend 300 minutes or 5 hours more in a day on such work. While the 711 minutes of men's work, the first two row in orange, are recognized and remunerated for, the 587 minutes of women's work are non-recognized as work, that is the unpaid work, the total of minutes of the yellow highlighted ones, and hence does not get counted and also remains unremunerated. This is the process where women's work gets undervalued and hence invisibilized to an extent that official statistics show a large number of women as not working. And this becomes a very difficult spot when we talk about women's empowerment and development by looking only at female labor force participation rates provided by the labor force statistics. Now, this kind of high incidence of unpaid work remains true for all countries, but the difference between the time use of men and women, as I said, is much starker in India. If I just say one more statistics, is that women work for 1,076 minutes per day and men work for 998 minutes per day. That is, women work almost 2 hours more per day than men. However, spends much more time in the unpaid household and caregiving work and also volunteer and training work as compared to men, and hence gets lost in the official statistics. On the other hand, the other thing that needs to be monitored, as I said, the second part of what I wanted to focus on was about the suitability of opportunities that exist for women in India. Now, if we look in the South Asian context, the characteristics of women's employment remains very similar. There is a concentration of women workers in agriculture. There's predominance of self-employment, in which unpaid family helpers or workers constitute the highest share. There's a high incidence of informal labor among non-agricultural activities for women. And in all these countries, service activities are slowly assuming more importance for women workers in urban areas. And this is represented by these three graphs, where you find that agriculture, the leftmost chart, which shows distribution of women workers by sectors of employment, shows that agriculture, the blue bar, is one of the most predominant for all the countries. That is, highest percentage of women workers are engaged in agriculture in South Asia, except for the exception of Sri Lanka. Similarly, if we look on the right, the first one, the top one, the distribution of women workers by status of employment shows predominance of self-employment, again the blue bar. And if we look at the share of female informal employment in non-agricultural employment, it is significant, more than 70%, on an average 75% for all the countries. Sri Lanka happens to be an exception in all of this. However, I'm not going to spend time on the Sri Lankan experience, but to turn my attention to the Indian story, where I want to highlight that, as I said, that while self-employment is very important and predominant among women's work in India, unpaid family helpers or workers are the most prominent within these within self-employment for women in India, which is to say that in addition to the self-employed, in addition to the unpaid care and domestic work that women perform, women also perform productive employment as unpaid family helpers, where their work is recognized within the national income accounting exercise, but they do not get remunerated. And that is also another concern which goes a long way towards somewhere hindering the development process and the building of agency for women. Now, the kind of also, if you look that there is a wage employment, the regular wage and salaried employment seems to be substantial for women workers in India. However, this slide shows us that the kind of regular work across the years for women has been very precarious and informal in nature. Women workers work in regular jobs with no written job contract, no eligibility for paid leaves, and a substantial women workers work in such employment without any social security benefits. So, having said that, despite having a regular income, women do suffer from issues of job security, a continuous sense of remaining employed, or any other benefits within the contract which improves working conditions or work towards providing formal employment contract. And the third thing that women's employment feature tells us is the persistent wage gaps or the earning gaps for men and women across types of employment in India, across self-employment and wage employment. Except for the Manrega, the gaps are very substantial, as you can see from this graph. Now, and finally, there are occupational rigidities in which we find that female-male ratios in select service occupations like domestic workers, garbage collectors are overwhelmingly female, whereas we find the aspirations of women to enter into urban desk jobs like finance and sales associate professionals or into social work related professionals and other associate professionals, which are basically service professionals. There we find some amount of aspirations, and the aspirations I'm saying because by looking at the trend in the data, which shows consistent increase in the female-male ratio. Apart from that, education and health service health sectors also have professionals which are also occupations traditionally preferred by women. Now, having said this, what I want to highlight is this is the condition of paid employment for women in and above to the conditions of unpaid work that I just gave. And therefore, what I want to argue here is that the diversity of occupations remains a very important concern for women. If we are talking about development and women's economic empowerment, we need to diversify the occupational patterns of women. And that kind of goes to the second important point, which I was trying to establish, that suitability of occupations, suitability of employment, which have conditions that facilitate women to work, are important driving factors to influence women's decision to get into the labor force. This also highlights that suitable opportunities preferred by women should also exist. It needs to be created and generated. And hence, when we talk about what do we monitor in terms of women's economic empowerment, I think it is one about definitely looking at what women do throughout their day, in their daily activities, the kind of activities that they perform throughout the day, and also to monitor the kind of opportunities that exist and what can be done to improve them. This clearly, the existing opportunities are not always attractive for women. The current labor force statistics has a question which actually asks women that if you are given an opportunity, women who spend majority of time on domestic duties, ask this question that if you are given an option, would you like to engage in some kind of a job? And 31% of them answer in the affirmative. As women's education level improves, their preferences with regard to jobs as well as the reservation wages alter accordingly. They want to look into or get engaged into occupations which are less precarious, involves less drudgery, and these altered expectations need to be accompanied with a commensurate increase in availability of such jobs which provide suitable remunerations and which is preferably sometimes outside the drudgery of agriculture. Else, we might get into a situation where more women with higher education might prefer to stay at home and invest more time in the education and health of their children and engage themselves more in domestic work. These are some of the monitoring metrics that needs to be really looked into deeply when we talk about women's economic empowerment. Therefore, while
Sona, if you could just wrap up in a couple of minutes.
One minute. This is my last slide and 1 minute I need. While women's work needs to be valued and recognized, the opportunities for women in labor markets also need to be monitored and upgraded as per the expectations of women, not only in terms of wages and remunerations or the types of activities and other working conditions, but also in terms of providing enablers like providing childcare facilities in the workplaces, like providing toilet facilities for women and hygiene facilities for women in the workspaces. And these are the metrics that needs to be monitored for overall development of women. And this is something that comes through the gender transformation of the macroeconomic policies. A tool, the gender budgeting tool, which is very important, which was touched upon by Vibhuti, is something that it has been used in India, has been effective in some places, and needs to be more effective in all the other aspects that I have spoken about right now. I want to rest here. Thank you.
Thanks, Sona. Love this visual that you have on your last slide. I think it just tells the story of your very detailed analysis and how critical this whole feminist economist perspective has been in shaping development agenda is something that I think we need to reflect on, because it's been at the heart of this whole macroeconomic analysis, at least for those of us who've been in the development space directly know that there is a rich, again, her story, not history, her story of literature, learnings, evidence, and analysis, which you have also very richly presented. Thanks so much, Sona. And I think one of the things is that this whole area of women's economic participation continues to be something that globally almost every country is falling behind on. And I think in the COVID context, where the job losses have been maximum for women, where there's other kinds of unpaid care burden, and just the economic status of women is something that is so vulnerable because of the precarity and informality of the work that they do. Very, very important points that you raised on how can we make this an agenda for diplomacy as we move forward. Thanks. And now we'll move to Deepika. Thank you for stepping in for Professor Sabiha, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Nandi. I'm very happy to be reading this short but very fascinating paper. The title of Professor Sabiha Hussain's paper is Gender Development and International Relations from a Gender Lens. Feminism in international relations does not withhold its reach narrowly to women and women's rights only, rather assumes a gender lens which looks at societal, political, economic, and global issues with the perspective of both men and women. To have a gender lens is to think about ways in which the world is organized according to gender categories, such as masculinity and femininity, and the ways in which and the ways in which those categories operate in terms of a hierarchy, and the ways in which they institutionalize and perpetuate certain kinds of inequalities. Feminist approach starts from gender, and it starts from gender as a hierarchical relational category and looks at the world through that lens. In the late 1980s, it was recognized that gender mattered to certain kinds of practices concerned with international relations, practices such as diplomacy, war, global relations, bearing in mind gender, and taking a variety of approaches to try to work out how gender matter in relation to IR. International relations, a gender lens. The relegation of women away from power or public life in general goes back a long way. And since power is at the root of international politics and to a large extent IR theory, it is important to note that women were viewed as subordinate in Western and Eastern political theories from the very beginning of the rising. Early feminist work on the state analyzed how women were subordinated by a centralized state. Later, however, it was realized that states are differentiated entities, and feminist interventions began in different aspects of the state and statecraft. It is from such roots that feminist interventions also began in the field of international relations, since IR began as a discipline that dealt with relations between states. Nevertheless, feminist perspectives in international relations occurred in the late 1980s and early 1990s, with publications of books such as In-Laws, Bananas, Beaches and Bases, 1989, Elstein's Women in War, 1987, Tickner's Gender in International Relations, Feminist Perspectives on Achieving Global Security, 1992, and 3 conferences, 1988 Millennium Journal of International Studies Conference at the London School of Economics, the 1989 conference at the University of Southern California, and the 1990 conference at Wells that launched a feminist approach in the field of IR. Among the early feminist theorists, 3 women stand out for their interventions in IR theory: John Bethke Elstein, Cynthia Enloe, and Ann Tickner. Their writings revealed theoretical deficiencies across the field. In Women and War, 10 years on, Elstein took up the core IR issues of war and discussed the dubious claim to IR knowledge. Enloe, in her authoritative work Bananas, Beaches and Bases, brings up the issues of nationalism. She claims that nationalism, being an important factor in state formation, brings from masculinized memory, masculinized humiliations, and masculinized hope. Ann Tickner's Gender in International Relations worked at basics to consider a reprisal of security from the feminist standpoint, focusing on exclusion of women, global economic security, and violence against women across sectors. Tickner poses questions for the state, asking whose interests does it aim to protect. He also questions the insecurity women face in the economic nationalist state. These questions reach the bone of international political economic thinking. Her objective is to locate feminist IR in official IR, integrating feminist perspectives into IR as the first step towards a new international relations that will transcend gender. Thus, the different aspects of gender-sensitive role of international relations give different perspectives. The myth of protection is challenged by harm done to women and children in war. Increasing number of women in military worldwide challenges the masculine image of the soldier. Hence, feminist theory broadens security conceptions beyond the masculine state. Feminist theorists appear to agree that patriarchy extends from the family to the state, and the patriarchal state has its roots in the patriarchal family unit. Rebecca Grant and Kathleen Newland, in their book Gender and International Relations, argue that women are excluded from IR theory because it is itself based on gender division of responsibilities and rights. Even the roles that women do perform in IR are omitted or unrecognized. Global politics are designated in a way that hide women's role in IR. Hence, in this light, feminists argue that women's roles and perspectives are excluded from IR due to gender bias in IR. Thus, the major task of feminists in IR is to locate the active participation of women in global politics and decision making, asking questions involving the active role of women in IR that had largely unaccounted for prior interventions, introducing perspectives on matters of peace, conflict, security, and war. They note that gender bias promulgated by political theory and IR puts forward a domestic international divide on the same framework as that of private-public divide that relegates women to the private and domestic sphere, while men act as active citizens on the stage, pertaining themselves to the public and the international. Feminists claim that women have always been present in international relations, but their participation has been subject to obscurity and opaqueness, owing to the gender biased lens of IR and IR theory. Another feminist analysis of international relations has been gender and IR, to the significance of gender. It introduces gender norms of masculinity and femininity into the discourse of IR, how gender shapes relations, ideas, and concepts in IR, and sets to examine beyond the issues of women. Conclusion. The question feminist scholars are asking is, if we have a gender-sensitive lens, it will be seen there is an absence of women in international policy making, and women's equality can only be achieved through removing these legal and also political obstacles. Though the feminist interventions in IR are diverse, but all are concerned about the invisibility of gender issues within mainstream IR theory. They all also agree that visibility requires considerable analysis of points in the international system and the theories that depict it, where women's understandings and contributions are choked off and men's are taken as the normal. Thank you.
Thanks for stepping in again, Deepika. Very fascinating paper about the extension of the feminist analysis of public-private also into IR domain. Very interesting. So without much ado, I'm just going to open up for comments, questions. I know that we already have a very active chat, so maybe we could start there. I know Swarna Rajagopalan and Swati Parashar both have put a few comments and questions. So do you want to comment, Swarna, and then maybe Swati?
Oh, I just wanted to say that I would love to read Vibhuti's paper slowly and soak in all of, each decade and each phase that she talks about. So it was essentially just a comment. And I think earlier for Ambassador Khobragade had actually said that one of the problems of access, of doing the kind of work you recommend, which I would love to do, which I've wanted to do all my life, is actually access. Because unless you are a Delhiite and you know someone in the ministry who will get you somewhere, everything from data, how many people, to who will give you time for an interview, all of that is up in the air. So people like me just stop wanting to do this stuff. So, this is something that I think maybe if we're having this conversation on an ICWA forum, we can actually look at ways in which we can facilitate this opening up, because you're absolutely right. The things that you're pointing to need to be documented. They need to be documented both in memoir and academically. But, we can only do it if we can find it.
Thank you for this
Well, I hope
reflection.
this is the beginning. Yeah.
Great. Swati, Dr. Swati Parashar, do you want to come in?
There's also a question from Dr. Shweta Singh. It's in the chat box.
Oh, yes, sorry, I missed that. Yeah. Shweta, why don't you come in and just ask the question directly?
Thank you so much. I think thank you to all the panelists for very, very insightful presentations. My question is to Ms. Khobragade, and I think I was very fascinated by the candidness of the experiences that you brought on board and across the spectrum. I was very intrigued when you used the word socio-political dynamics of Indian foreign service. As a feminist, I was curious, how would you unpack that? So that's one. And on the second count, I was also thinking about development cooperation aid. And because you spoke about development cooperation aid and a conscious effort in terms of India to mainstream, in terms of gender mainstreaming, I was actually intrigued because I thought there was not a coherent policy on the same. So what would be your insights to that? Thank you once again.
Should I go in and answer, or will we take no more questions?
No, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for that question. First, I'll start with the development cooperation aid and your understanding and feeling that there isn't a coherent picture and that we haven't really, thought about gender and development cooperation, and you are not, and I think the perception is not entirely incorrect, and I'll be candid about that because of the fact that it's not, as I said, the understanding of women and gender and development and gender and governance policies is there in I think across the board in the government, and that does not exclude the MEA. The reason perhaps why we don't look at or we don't articulate in a very policy statement our endeavors towards gender and engaging or looking at gender parity, gender equality, and gender equitable development cooperation work is also because it flows from the perspective of an entirely non-prescriptive and non-interventionist foreign policy that we have followed traditionally. And therefore, we do not want to make it into a narrative, make it into a narrative that will lead to this discourse where we are seen as a donor, and as a donor that brings in implications and conditionalities of, let's say, gender development, certain parameters of gender and development. We do not want to do that. We do not want to be first seen as a donor, and then we do not want to be seen as a donor that brings in these sort of conditionalities. And hence there is not a narrative and then not a discourse, but there is understanding, at the ground level as we work. As I said, we do look at every project, development cooperation project, what sort of if it's a large infrastructure project, what is it that we are looking at in terms of environmental impact, social impact. These studies are inherent part of our project, management and project implementation that we do, as well as all the capacity building programs, and we'll always examine impacts on all the SDG goals. And we, in fact, classified last year when we brought out our brochures for our development, for our capacity building programs. I made sure that each program had a SDG against it that it was affecting. So yes, there is that understanding within the ministry. However, and then, okay, going to the other question about the socio-political dynamics, what I meant also was, while this is not a subject that is, as I said, there aren't too many conversations about this within the Foreign Service, because it's an unstated understanding that we represent the entire country with all its socio-political, elements as one entity abroad. And hence, perhaps that is what prevents this conversation from happening. This is just my understanding, or rather a conjecture, and it's not really backed by any research because there isn't any. But I think we really need to look at the sort of socio-cultural backgrounds of people that now are coming into the Foreign Service, and especially with more and more women coming in from rural backgrounds, more and more general, all the participants coming from different backgrounds, socio-economic and from different stratas of society. I think this is an extremely great change in the Foreign Service since the beginning of, since independence, since 1946. It's just completely changed the characteristic of the Foreign Service. And how does that affect our policy and foreign policy abroad? That's something that we really need to study. That's what I meant.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Swati. We had noted your comment and question. Do you want to go ahead?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I had a question for Vibhuti ji, but my question can be to the entire panel as well, because we're reflecting on some of these really key issues. We talk about it. I'm based in Sweden here, but very happy to be part of an event that's happening in a part of the world that I'm closely connected to. I think there's a global gender backlash. This is something that we use the term quite loosely. There's a backlash. It, of course, manifests in various ways in terms of, academic structures where gender studies has been attacked, or in various other ways in which, feminists or activism, those kinds of spaces are not exactly that visible or are facing a lot of challenges. So given the really vast experience of work, that you have and being part of the movement, where do you see the future of transnational movement? And by that, feminist networks, transnational movement. And I ask this particularly because we are also watching, some of it as a reaction to COVID and, the emergence of perhaps a new world where we are going to be more and more insular looking. We have seen the emergence of nationalisms everywhere. States are becoming hard line. Borders are very visible as much as we talk about a trans-border world. So in these times when there's so much insular aspects of political identities, social identities, how will we, have these conversations? That's one. And the other thing is, where are these conversations missing? I mean, we often hear north-south, we need to keep talking. And in the morning session also, we talked about all the post-colonial works and, everything that people are writing about. But aren't the real conversations missing, perhaps also within Global South spaces? And I don't know. I mean, I'm asked. You did tell us that Dalit feminists are now more visible, and we are listening to them. Hopefully, same with Adivasi feminists, perhaps, and Adivasi activists. But where are these conversations missing, and how can we hear them? Thank you.
I think two things are happening, because a lot of churning is taking place at a ground level. If you attend a regional level or a village level or a peri-urban places where people like 800,000 women, first generation learners, they come, they are the ones who are now aspiring, and they are demanding their rights, whether it is a menstrual taboo or discriminatory practices or child marriages. Now currently, it was the girls who were ringing up the helpline, that they are forcing me. Did you ever imagine such thing happening 10 years back? So they are asserting, all of them are different versions of Malala, who are challenging the status quo, and the backlash is also there. And solidarities are also increasing, that I say. So I think polarization is very, very sharp. Even when I have gone in the investigation for the Pink Chaddi movement, or women who were attacked by the boys when they went to the pub, and who were these boys? These were the boys who felt that they missed the bus, because they had studied in a local language. They were working in some small little shop with getting 30 or 40 rupees daily wages. And these girls who were in the same locality, who were playing with them, they had moved ahead. And as soon as they got their BA and MA, they were getting 30,000 at the call center. So this economic inequality, cultural inequality, the whole digital divide, all of them are also accentuating that kind of anger, and that collective cohesive community life is also gone. But at the same time, new types of alliances that are happening, that is also like the professional bodies. Almost all women in different professions, they have their own WhatsApp groups. They have their own this thing. So at one level, you see that there is there is attack on women, but at the same time, women are entering the fields. Like when I joined 40 years back, when I joined academic institution, whether they were teachers or staff, nobody aspired any kind of promotion. They joined as a lecturer, they retired as a lecturer. A clerk would be joined as a lecturer, lowest in the administration. Now, in my office, even within 2 years of permanency, that girl would say, "Ma'am, I have done CA. I want to become office superintendent. Why can't I apply for a deputy registrar's post?" So this is also happening, and then you see the sexual harassment, gossiping, the character assassination, and that because now women are aspiring, and I think same is happening because women are entering into the areas where earlier there was no space for them. That one, I see this process as a 5-step ahead, 2-step backward kind of a thing. Because even when Priyanka Bhutmange's rape happened, all the girls in school uniform, directly from school, they were going for Rasta Roko with a school bag. I had never seen such kind of a mobilizations. Currently also you see so much at the ground level, this thing. And the most interesting thing I find when I go for gender responsive budgeting training of Panchayat women. For me, it started in 1994. It was the women elected corporators of Mumbai who were laughed at by the male corporators because they did not know what is expenditure, what is revenue. They could not read budget book. And they said, your utility is only to do flag hoisting and offering flowers to the leaders. That is how they were laughed at, and it all started. And now you see these women, they are making it, they may be illiterate, they may be semi-literate, but they know all the intricacies of budget. Those who were earlier applying were hesitant to apply for funds. Even for 1 lakh rupees, they are now managing the crores of rupees of funds. No, and they are assertive. So I think that like just 4 days back, they started for the first time elected representatives of Rajasthan. Now Rajasthan has a criteria of 12th pass. So all the new women elected, and there are 50% elected representatives in Panchayat are women. All of them are educated. They are educated. They are postgraduate. This thing, and 12th pass is the criteria. And you can see the kind of urge they have to feminist thinking. And for them, like when you interact with them in Hindi or you interact with people in Marathi or Gujarati, there is so much of receptivity. Only thing, there is a vacuum, and I think we need to fill up that vacuum and reach out to them. I think that is a great opportunity. People like us could survive emergency, where 5,000 of my fellow activists were behind the bar under MISA. And that's what I think I'm quoting Uma Chakravarti. I said, Uma, what will happen? They said, nothing will happen. We survived the emergency of those 8 months of terror. Don't you think currently we have freedom of press? We can reach out. We have a social media, and we can reach out to a world over. Whole global community is watching us. So I think things are much better. Only thing, we need to stick out our neck collectively. Individually, if we do, then we will be chanting. But if we are together with each other, then this thing, and Swarna is doing a great work. We all rally around Prajna's activities. I feel optimistic. Yeah, I don't think that things are so.
Thank you for the plug.
Thanks very much, Vibhuti. Sona, do you have any last comments on any of the questions or any other thoughts you want to share with the group? Otherwise, we'd move towards closing it. I think we don't have time for any more questions. Do we, Ankita?
No, it's all.
Thanks, Subhu, but I don't have much more to add.
So you made a brilliant presentation.
Okay, great. And I think in the chat, I'm just seeing some of the latest messages that have come in. Can the women's movement in India pave the way for a feminist foreign policy? I think you said you are optimistic. So let's see. Yes. And then participation of more and more women in decision-making processes nationally and internationally. That's a recommendation that's come in from Dr. Abhilash Nayak. And is there any serious debate of divergence between Dalit and mainstream feminists in India? I think you also touched upon that.
That is a
some
convergence.
Of those tensions. Yeah. I mean, both the tensions as well as a convergence in sort of the mainstream feminist movement. Yeah. So I think we have very little time, and I will not even try to sum up this very rich session. I think it's been a very interesting, like I said, very diverse set of voices in this panel, and I'm really privileged to have been part of it. Thank you very much. I do think that as we move forward, just in terms of 3 takeaways I've written for myself is, what I understand, and I think I'm probably repeating a little bit of what's been said in the morning. I was there for a couple of sessions, but one is, the analysis of what matters. How can that become part of the agenda? That's really the first thing, whether it's the kind of analysis feminist economists that Sona presented, or, what are the issues from the intersectionality lens that Vibhuti spoke about. identifying the problem and then setting the agenda in IR. I think that's the first step. How do we do that? How do we improve our research? Dr. Khobragade suggested there are certain research gaps. We don't understand enough about the praxis of it. So how does the theory and reality in that sense come together? And really, how does research and activism come together that we've heard a lot of the speakers talk about? So the what matters, how do we make it matter? And I think there were many examples of different kinds of, you spoke about Vibhuti transnational feminism, you spoke about multilateralism, Dr. Khobragade spoke about diplomacy, and so there are different spaces in which the agenda setting can happen, is happening, and should be happening, I suppose. And I think the last point is some of the levers that we heard a lot of you talk about is about also individual role models. It's also about those champions. It's also about those leaders who are at the right place at the right time. And it's about them working with broader constituents of women's rights and gender equality to shape agenda. I think that is my takeaway from this session, and I cannot thank enough Professor Chaturvedi, Dr. Raghavan, Ankita, and the team at ICWA for this very interesting discussion, and I'm hoping that we'll stay in touch and be part of taking forward the agenda as a community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nandi, for moderating this session, and to all of our participants for their presentations. Now, with this, we come to an end of our day one of the webinar. Thank you all for your active participation. We have had some very fruitful discussions today. Hope we continue this tomorrow. We will join back tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. IST. Hope to see you all then. Good evening.
Thank you. Excellent. Very well.
Thank you. Thank you.